What I want us to be thinking about this afternoon is about young company. And that's pretty much the opposite of these large elephants. Because when you think about international business, if I ask you to name 3 international companies, what are some of the companies that would come to mind? Apple, Facebook, Walmart, Google. Amazon, Google. Okay, you guys are very young. Any other big companies? IKEA, very. Huawei, Geely, okay. McKinsey, right? Okay. Yeah. And what's common to all of these companies is that they're big. When I went to business school in the late 90s, if people asked that question, people would think of companies like Coca-Cola, Nike, that sort of thing. But again, these are all big companies, right? When we think of international business, we usually think of large multinational companies, and for good reason. But what I'm here to talk about is the fact that international business, or going international, is not the preserve of large corporations. Even young gazelles can go international, even young companies go international too. And so how do they do this? What are the key success factors? That's really what I want to be talking about this afternoon. Now, this gentleman here is called Wang Jun. He is the founder of a little company, of this company here called Testin. I don't know if you can make out. How many of you have heard of Testin? Not one. And I have never been in a room where I have mentioned Testin and anyone has heard of them. But I can guarantee you that if you use a mobile app in China, almost certainly you've used an app that has been tested on Testin's technology. So Testin is a startup that was founded in 2011, and within a few months of being founded, had already worked with Microsoft in Beijing and IBM also in Beijing. And to me is very much reflective of what is possible today in China. Young companies being able to rub shoulders with large international corporations. And this could, in some way, also help them when they are thinking of going international. So Testin was founded in 2011 with a group of people who had worked in the software testing industry. So 2011, coincidentally, is when I arrived in China. And it was, I remember some of my friends back in the UK telling me, you know, mate, you got it completely wrong. Screwed up the timing badly, because we just had 3 horrible years in the West after the financial crisis. China kept growing during that period, partly because of or largely because of the government stimulus. So a lot of infrastructure was being built. China's growth rate was pretty decent, actually, even between 2008 and 2011. And I arrive in China, and for the first time, the growth rate dips below 10%. And so, you know, people were saying, you just got the timing completely wrong. What I didn't know, and they didn't know, was 2011 was also when this little new app called WeChat was born. In fact, when I first arrived, I hardly heard anybody talk about WeChat. It was all QQ. And, you know, people had very specific things. Such and such is the such and such of China. So, for example, Renren was the Facebook of China. Things like that. And then over time, we know that WeChat has become the sort of super app. My point is, that was when the mobile internet, a new era, began in China. And this bunch of people had the foresight to recognize that what that probably meant was there was going to be a heck of a lot of mobile apps. But because the conditions in China are so different from elsewhere, say compared to the US, where a lot of mobile apps were coming from in those days, you would need to test these apps and make sure that they were optimized to work on different devices. I mean, the people in this room probably have Apple phones and Samsung phones and so on. But I mean, there are a lot of other Chinese people in you go further away from Shanghai who use other kinds of handsets, right? Lower end handsets. There's also a lot of variance in terms of the quality of the telecom infrastructure. So you need to test, make sure that these apps work in all of these different conditions, and that's the opportunity. Entrepreneurship starts with the identification of opportunity. And this is the opportunity these guys were able to identify, but it's not just about what you observe in the external environment, it's also what you as individuals have in terms of your prior experience and background. And these people have the software testing expertise. And so, opportunity lies at the nexus between external possibility and internal capability. And they were able to see this opportunity. They started off in Beijing. Actually, the co-founders pooled together some money. They bootstrapped it, and then very quickly started developing and growing. The reason I heard about Testin, I said to you, one of my research is about how startups dance with gorillas. And I went to Beijing and met a few companies, including IBM and Microsoft. And I asked them, tell me the best 3 to 4 startups you worked with. And each company gave me a list, and Testin was the only startup that was common to both the Microsoft list and the IBM list. And on the back of that, they've been able to build a whole bunch of relationships with both Western and Chinese companies. And this is a very, very small sample of the apps that have been tested on Testin technology. So you have JD.com's app, and which is of course Chinese, but you also have the McDonald's app, which is a foreign company operating in China. Now you can see why a company like this will have done very well, right? They were at the right place at the right time. They've been able to grow with the internet mobile in China. When they got their last round of funding a couple of years ago, their valuation was over $500 million. So, that makes sense in a way, right? What could the opportunities for a company like this to go international be? What do you think? They might go to other emerging markets, which also have similar conditions, like what China was a few years before. Great answer, yeah? Excellent. And you can see evidence of that here as well, right? You can see that there are international companies already in China, and others may want to come in as well. Anything else? What would the reverse of that idea be? Exactly. So for a company like Testin, which is actually very successful in China at the moment, you might even think they wouldn't even be bothered about thinking about going international, right? But as it happens, in the last couple of years, they have been thinking about this very seriously. One reason, of course, is they are anyway dealing with international companies that are coming here, helping those companies to make sure their apps are optimized here. But there are also Chinese companies that are going international. So you mentioned India and other emerging markets. ShareIt is a Beijing-based company. Have any of you heard of ShareIt? No, because you don't probably have any need for it. This allows people to share files and apps and data, even if the internet infrastructure is not great. But in a country like India, where the infrastructure is not so great, ShareIt has been very popular, and there was a time when it was in the top 3 downloads. Just Talk, have any of you heard of Just Talk? No, neither had I when but it turns out that this is basically an app that allows you to call video to video from one phone to another. Nobody in China considers it because you can use WeChat. But a couple of engineers who are working within China Unicom, basically developing some video technology for internal testing purposes, just to see that the China Unicom bandwidth was good enough to handle video. They looked at their technology and said, hey, actually, this is pretty nice stuff that we've come up with. Maybe we should set up our own company and create an app. And then when they did that, they found nobody in China was interested. However, having uploaded it onto the Apple App Store, they were amazed to find that they had a decent number of downloads in the US, in Dubai, in South Africa. And so they are basically looking at international markets. And I went and met the founder of Just Talk, and he had just come back from California, having attended the Facebook developer conference, right? Which is not something you would do if you were just interested in China. So this company epitomizes this idea that even young companies, and now I'm talking about Testin, we saw a couple of other examples that has inspired Testin to think about it. And so, when you're going international, essentially you have some starting point. And then there is often the first destination, and then the question of, when that has gone well, how do you go beyond that? And from a lot of the research I've been doing for over 10 years and a lot of the articles that we see other people's research, there seem to be 5 very important things that matter. The first of which is learning about other markets. Okay? If there's nothing else you remember from today's lecture, remember this. Internationalization is a learning process. Companies that are very successful in their home market can find the international market seen to be completely different. And so really, success at internationalization is largely about how successful you are at learning about the internationalization process. But then there's also a second very important factor, which is the starting point. What is the innovation? What is it that you have that makes someone else in another country want to buy into your offering? And underpinning both of these learning aspects, knowledge aspects, is a very important third piece, which is around networks. And then finally, thinking about how you manage growth, but also thinking about local context. Because very often when we think about international business, we think in terms of countries. And that makes sense to say, okay, this is a Chinese company going into the US market. But especially in large countries, it's important to think of local context at the subnational level as well. It's a very different proposition being a startup developed in Zhongguancun in Beijing versus a tech startup developed in, say, Ningbo, where I used to live. And so where you come from in terms of local context can be important, but where you end up in the other markets, especially in large markets, I think it's pretty meaningless to talk about a US market strategy for a company going into the US, or to talk about a China market strategy, especially for young companies coming into China. You normally don't enter everywhere in China. You normally enter a very specific part of China. And there are huge variations, as you know very, very well, across the different provinces, within a province, across the different cities, and in big cities, just across the different districts, in terms of policy and what you can do with government, for example. So I'm going to talk you through each of these 5 points. That's going to really be the content for today. If you want to jump in with questions, comments at any point, feel free. Usually in the MBA class, it's not so much of me talking. What would typically happen is I would have given you the Testin case. I've actually written a case about Testin, which you would have read in advance, and we would have spent a good chunk of time discussing that and then moving into the lecture part, okay? So let's start with this first piece. As I say, in some ways, to me, this is the most important thing. So if I begin to bore you and you go to sleep only after I finish point 1, okay? So it's pretty intuitive to understand. With new ventures, you have a double challenge. You have the disadvantage, first of all, of being a new venture. You know, all the challenges associated with that. Lack of an established track record. You don't have any brand recognition. No one knows who the heck you are, whether they should take you seriously or not. You don't have a large amount of resources. Now, you also have the other problem of being a foreign company. And foreign companies have the general challenge, which is all things being equal, customers tend to be loyal to their own companies. They have more familiarity with their own companies. They tend to support their own companies. All things being equal, right? Which means if a foreign company attracts the loyalty of customers, it means that they have something special, something different. There has to be some differentiation. And the local government ain't on your side if you're a foreign company, right? They are essentially, going to, again, all things being equal, support their local companies. So foreign companies typically are discriminated against, not necessarily unfairly, meaning it's all very transparent. There are rules that say if you're a foreign company, then you have these other restrictions. In China, if you're a foreign technology company, you can't have your own cloud hosting. Apple in China is the only market where Apple doesn't host the iCloud accounts, right? These are all hosted down in Guizhou somewhere with a third party. So as a foreign company, you have rules going against you, and now Chinese companies are discovering that when they go to America, they have rules that aren't in their favor. And these are two sort of extreme sort of cases, but in general, so foreign company disadvantages, the sort of academic kind of terminology you will hear if you ever bother to read some of the researches. This is the liability of newness, and this is the liability of foreignness. So it's hard. There's lack of knowledge about local conditions and limited resources to build such knowledge. But the key is to overcome these barriers, because you need to learn about these foreign market situations. So you can think about this learning challenge in two ways, okay? One is about in terms of the content of learning, what to learn. So you have market-specific knowledge on the one hand, which is understanding the macro-environmental factors, the industry factors, and the customer factors. And this, by the way, is very much the sort of thing you will be looking at in a strategy core course, for example, or a marketing core course. And when you're thinking about international entrepreneurship, you really need to be integrating all the knowledge you pick up on these kinds of subjects. So when we think about macro environmental factors, you may have already heard of something called the PEST framework or the PESTEL framework. If not, you will hear about that in a strategy course, understanding about the political, the economic, the socio-cultural, the technological, these kinds of macro characteristics that you can't influence. No single company can influence. It's like the weather. You need to understand what it is and then adjust accordingly. But then you also have industry factors. So you could think of in terms of Michael Porter's 5 forces analysis. That's another framework you would learn on the strategy course. Some of you may be already familiar with it and understand this. And then things you will pick up on marketing. Understanding customer factors. What do customers in this market want? And in some cases, it's a slight adjustment. In some cases, it's a dramatic adjustment. When you think about food, for example, that's usually one area where you see huge adjustments, right? So you think about McDonald's. Not that McDonald's is a young, small company, but just to make the point about adaptation. When you think of McDonald's, what is the main product that they sell? What type of food? Burgers. They sell burgers. Very good. When you think of burgers, what meat do you think of? Beef, very good. Okay, so in the UK a few years ago there were these huge trucks that had the McDonald's logo and it said 100% beef on the truck. And what were they trying to communicate? I don't know if you remember, but back then there was a horse meat scandal. And what they were assuring customers is we only have the real stuff in it, you know. Now, one of the big emerging markets that they entered, that you mentioned earlier, was India. What proportion of their revenues in India come from beef burgers, do you think? 0. Because it's not even that they knew most people won't eat, and so maybe they could offer beef burgers to the few who could. They just didn't want it for there to be any chance that it was used in their kitchens for anyone to have the slightest doubt that there might be beef in it, right? Same company, supposedly a burger company, goes to a market without selling beef burgers. I mean, that is what you have to take into account when you're thinking about customer factors. But then, apart from the sort of market-specific knowledge, you also need more generalizable knowledge in terms of principles, rules of thumb that help you make some key decisions. Where to internationalize, when to internationalize, how to internationalize. And in fact, when you make an international market entry decision, in some senses, you're making all of these decisions simultaneously. But to be able to develop capabilities over time, and these things are both important. Obviously, when you start with a international market entry, you're starting with a specific market. But then as this becomes a series of market entries, then what you're trying to do is abstract this knowledge and this understanding to be able to develop a more general international knowledge. So as I already said, in terms of the market-specific knowledge, you will be thinking about these different factors, and in the context of an MBA, these are very much the sort of things you'll be getting to learn frameworks, not from the entrepreneurship class, but well before that, when you're doing strategy and marketing and so on. And in terms of the more general knowledge, these are the sort of things that you will be wanting to think about. Articulating a global purpose. Why are we going international? So a couple of years ago, the dramatically new internet-related business that everybody could see on the roads, what was it in China? Mobike and OFO, right? The bike sharing phenomenon. That was the new thing. And it's only been 2 years. The first time I saw a Mobike was August 2016, when it came to Pudong for the first time. And in that period, we all know that Mobike entered a lot of different markets. Now, of course, that seems to have slowed down. But you would have to ask the question, why? Why is a company like this going international? Why do you think Mobike was going international? They already had a huge market in China, right? Why go international? Okay, so one possibility, but what do you get by going international that helps you maybe to attract more investment?
Branding.
So maybe having a wider brand, or a better known brand. What does having a better known brand help you do? How do you get bigger value? How do you get greater value? Okay, but even to get that, so that was to get the investment, you want the bigger evaluation, you want to have the bigger brand. What is it that they're after at one level, sort of a lower level of abstraction? What is the specific goal? What are they trying to increase? What is the measurable thing they're trying to? Is it market share? Revenue? Exactly. They were going after a number that very few platforms had achieved. they were looking to become one of the few 1 billion user platforms. That would give you the data, that would then give you bigger branding, that would give you bigger valuation, so on and so forth. Now, that, by the way, I don't think is happening at that same accelerated rate. I think the acquisition by Meituan changes things dramatically. But at least, when I spoke to the guy who was then the head of, the director of international development, he had a clear answer to the question, why are you going international? And what he imagined was a future where in pretty much every major city in the world, there would be a two-horse race between them and OFO. Now, we can debate about how sensible all of that was. My simple point is, when you go international, it can't simply be because it seems like a cool thing to do. Or, you know, it's a glamorous thing to do and I can brag to my buddies that I'm going international. There has to be a pretty clear purpose for this. And very often you figure that you can't do everything yourself for the very reason that you don't know everything there is to know about the new market. And in some cases, by law, you are forced to work with a partner. So alliance building becomes one of these general capabilities. Building a supply chain in certain cases very critical. Building a multicultural, a country organization. And this, by the way, is one of the huge challenges that Chinese companies are facing when they go overseas. They are masters in terms of doing business in China, and then the moment they go overseas and then have to deal with non-Chinese employees, deal with a non-Chinese media, different kinds of stakeholders, then it becomes a completely different story. And you need to have employees who are managed by a completely different set of labor laws, have very different expectations of what the relationship with the Laoban will be, very different culture, so on and so forth. That becomes a huge challenge and relates very much to the final point of cross-cultural competence, which, by the way, happens to be one of the big attractions of coming to a place like this, where you, in the general daily course of life, get to develop this kind of expertise. So this is about the content of the knowledge, the what. But there's also, where do we get this learning from? So the learning can come from the venture itself. It can come from the pre-founding experiences of the top management teams, and some of the people who are involved maybe have international experience. Many of you in this room have probably actually studied abroad. Some of you may have even worked abroad. There are a lot of returnees who come back to China. Just yesterday I was talking to a young man who used to work in Wall Street, a Chinese guy from Fujian province, used to work in Wall Street, has a PhD in mathematics, very clever guy, but now has come back to Hangzhou and has basically started a IT, healthcare IT based company, and so he's able to use some of the experience that he has from before. But to be honest, a lot of the learning happens experientially. It is by going overseas and doing things in international markets that you actually learn what it's about. And sometimes the sensible way to do this is to do this on a small scale initially, get some learning and then build on this. Because very often what happens when you go international is you experience failure because of unanticipated problems. It is part of the nature of stepping into the unknown. It's better to anticipate that there might be difficulties and therefore, but to treat this, then this is the important thing, to treat it as a learning experience. What are we going to learn from this? But then, while it's useful to learn from your own mistakes, it's even better to learn from other people's mistakes. So look at what other people are doing. Observe the experiences of others, including competitors, but also take advantage of the possibility of learning from your partners. And so if I bring these two things together, what we learn and who we learn from, you can have market-specific knowledge that you learn oneself. You compare your expectation and the reality when you're going into a specific market. Improvise, see what you need to do to adjust and learn in the process. And then over time, you can synthesize that into rules of thumb, to heuristics that help you understand how you can think about internationalization in general, and then also learn from others, learn from your peers and partners. Look at what other similar types of companies are doing, but also see what you can learn from global partners, what other big companies are doing, which have internationalized into different countries over time. And very often, how fast you can internationalize is a function of how fast you can learn. And that is why I say this, to me, in many ways, is the very important piece. And what is Testin doing? So a couple of years ago, Testin decided to open an office in San Francisco. But they're doing it on a relatively small scale, and their learning is basically embodied in this young man, who is probably of a similar age as many of you in the room, in his late 20s. He was working for a software testing company in the US, and then Mr. Wang met him. And when he met Mr. Wang, he was very inspired to hear about a Chinese company that is trying to work in mobile app testing with in other markets. And so now he's at this very young age, he's the general manager of Testin in the US. And basically, what they're trying to do is, on a daily basis, find ways to work with local companies, see what it is they need, what do they have to do differently to satisfy those customers' needs, what advantages do they have that they can offer. And so, you have somebody on the ground, maybe, but not necessarily too many people too soon, and invest in people like this so that you can learn. Okay, from this point onwards, if you want to take a nap, that's okay. That was really very, very critical. But it goes without saying that, if you're going to go into international markets, if you're going to be taken seriously, you have to have some good reason for them to be talking to you, right? You have to have some point of differentiation. And that means that you need to have some basis of innovation. That's what helps you to have globally mobile offerings. Internationalization decisions can be made only if you have something that has a demand overseas. And that helps to overcome the disadvantage of foreignness. Because of the disadvantage of newness, though, it'll probably be a relatively narrow niche. There's something that you want to specialize in, and Testin is a perfect example of that. They're not saying that they are Alibaba or Baidu. They are very specific. It's around testing, hence the name Testin, right? And they might diversify beyond mobile apps. Maybe there are other things that they can apply the testing technology to, but they're pretty clear about their core strength. And I think that's very important when you are young and small. Now, the important point here, though, is we need to think about innovation holistically. It does not have to be only about product innovation in the way in which you think about innovation coming out of Israel, for example. There could be important innovation around process, but also importantly, and I think this is where Chinese companies actually excel, it's in terms of business model innovation. Now, all of these are important, so we need to be thinking about them all. Having a compelling offering, that's one way to overcome the disadvantage of newness and foreignness. But of course, recognize that often there's a window of opportunity. A few years ago, I was doing research in Cambridge in England, 10 years ago, in fact. And one of the things that these companies were people in Cambridge were very disappointed about is Cambridge University has amazing technology. Lots of startups were getting formed, but there wasn't one single big success story, like the big companies that have come out of Silicon Valley. And a lot of people were pinning their hopes on this startup called Plastic Logic. And this was something based on technology that had come out of one of the labs in Cambridge. And they were going to develop some sort of screen which would allow you to read books, and it was going to revolutionize the way in which people interacted with reading material. And attracted a lot of VC money. There was a lot of hype around it. 3 months before they were going to launch, a bit after the time I had been there, a company in Seattle called Amazon, that you may have heard of, came up with a little product called the Kindle. And when the Kindle happened, the attractiveness of this technology completely disappeared, because even though it was a superior screen, you could basically do, at a slightly maybe lesser quality, what these guys were offering. And so this company had completely rethink its strategy. There is a window of opportunity before competition comes in. And so with product innovation, this is one of the big challenges. Processes can be innovated too. It may not be because of the product, but because of how it is developed, produced, marketed. And basically, this could result in enhanced value for money. Maybe the product is not fantastically superior technology, but because of the process innovation, the customer gets better value for money. To be honest, we've seen a lot of this sort of stuff coming out of China, and you can apply that in other emerging markets. Quicker time to market. So I don't know if you're aware, but our school, CEIBS, has a small campus in Ghana, in Accra, Ghana. Ghana in West Africa? Chinese name is Diana. So I go and teach there every year. And when I'm there, the staff at the school and some other people will show me phones and say, this is a Chinese brand. And I would have never come across it in China. But it's not product technology, but it's process technology that's allowing these companies to have an enhanced value for money that works in certain other markets. In some cases, you can have greater societal impact, thus reputation, again, because you're able to contribute to the welfare of society. When I went to Ghana the first time and came out of the airport, the big hoarding I saw right after I stepped out of the airport had Huawei on it. And I tell you, when I was having conversations with people there, they were saying our telecom infrastructure would not be possible without Huawei. And I don't think Huawei's technology was really breakthrough product technology in terms of what was being used there, but because of their process innovations allowing them to create reasonable value for money, reasonable offerings, but at a very competitive pricing, you could have societal impact. And in emerging markets, you also see the scope for frugal innovation. Here in Shanghai, people have no clue what that means, but there are other parts of China, certainly other emerging markets, where people have very, very low-cost offerings to serve the needs of large rural markets. So large but low in affordability. And I think it's very easy to underestimate the value of these. But I think really a lot of the innovation we're seeing in China is around business models. So you need to recognize what are the globally standard elements of the business model, what aspects of it can work in other markets, and what elements of the business model have to be adapted. And this, by the way, is the fundamentals of international strategy. Any international company, whether big or small, when they go international, they are dealing with a tension. You want to keep things as standard as possible because that's more efficient. At the same time, you want to adapt to satisfy your customers better. And so this simultaneous pull towards integration or standardization versus adaptation or localization, right? And when we think in terms of business model, you have to think about that from a business model point of view. Because not everything may be uniform. So you have to mix and match what you can do in different parts of the world. And so here, my key message is innovate holistically. It's much more than simply thinking of product innovation, especially when we're thinking about emerging markets like China. It's not possible for every company to be like Apple. It's not possible for every company to be like these Israeli startups that you will see if you go on the Israel elective. But instead, if we think more holistically, you can think in terms of product and process and business model innovation. And then the key thing is to understand, so what do we need to keep globally uniform? What do we need to adapt? And that's true in terms of the business model innovation as well, because what you're trying to do maybe is to identify what is the platform that can be kept pretty standard, but what are the value-added services that require the local logistics, that require the local partnerships, right? Again, you just have to figure out how to deal with differences across customers. One of the reasons why Mobike and Orfo were able to rapidly increase spread across China is that the legal requirements in terms of cycling are not as stringent as, for example, a market like Australia. What is the big difference between Australia and China when it comes to cycling on the roads? Exactly. So here there is no requirement to have a helmet, to wear a helmet. In Australia, you do. So even when Mobike and Orfo did internationalize into Australia, they had to figure out how are we going to make that provision. And then, you know, it's one thing to say, I don't mind getting onto a bicycle that somebody else used. Do I want to wear a helmet that somebody else has used, you know? So these sort of issues you have to take into account as well. But really the point is, take advantage of local location-specific advantages, meaning we can do different things in different markets based on the advantages they have. In some cases, you actually have more sophisticated technology. That might be a good place to locate more of the product innovation related activities. And we're seeing that with many Chinese companies. We're seeing that with Testin trying to locate in San Francisco. At the same time, there may be other places which are advantageous because the costs are lower. And now Chinese companies are finding that China ain't a low-cost area anymore. And so, you know, how do you... Yesterday I was talking to a Chinese entrepreneur who has relocated some of their activities to Vietnam. And I think we're going to be seeing more of this. So how do we take advantage of different locations in terms of thinking about our wider innovation strategy? And as I said, with Testin, you know, they have an existing China lab, but the key thing that they did when they hired this young man, Henry Jia, in San Francisco, they don't want to have lots and lots of people there to be doing marketing, but they sure as heck are interested in tapping into the innovation of the Bay Area, and they've created a lab there. And, you know, how can these large elephants also help? They haven't gone away, right? So these big companies are there. And I think it's important to recognize that startups could tap into the global innovation networks of these large companies. There are opportunities for new creations to create complementary offerings to these multinational offerings, because these companies are looking for innovation in multiple markets, including emerging markets. And there are now intermediaries that can help new ventures tap into global innovation networks. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Silicon Valley doing some research interviews, and I met 2-3 companies there, which their only job now is, how do we help big companies find innovative startup partners? One of them is called Plug and Play, and they have convinced groups of large companies, even companies that are competing with each other, to sit in a room like this and listen to a pitch from startups that they curate and bring in front of them. There's another company called Testin that works with large corporations like Barclays, for example. Barclays is a big bank in the UK. And they help them to run corporate accelerators twice a year. So they will bring 10 startups to them, 3-month period, and Barclays will try to figure out ways. You know, companies like Barclays are so scared that they are being disrupted by digital technology. So rather than get disrupted by digital startup, they would much rather work with them and influence their direction by working with them from an early stage. Well, From the startup's point of view, this can be an advantage. So Techstars helped Barclays to do an accelerator in London during the spring. Coincidentally, I was in London in the spring and visited Barclays. And then when I went to California 2 weeks ago, I met one of the startups that had been in that London accelerator called Crowdz, C-R-O-W-D-Z. And they were telling me how, since we had met in London, they now have been able to develop some new technology for Barclays. And it's a win-win, because Barclays is now getting the advantage of this startup's new technology. The startup now can proudly say, we have Barclays as a customer. How does that help with those two problems we talked about at the beginning? Liability of newness, liability of foreignness. Makes a huge difference, right? So today, if they come to China, and by the way, they now do have somebody on the ground in China, they're trying to get customers here. When they introduce themselves as a Barclays partner, they immediately have much more credibility because they have worked with an international company. And so, and they have evidence of their innovation, which is the point I want to make here. So it's important to recognize that in this process of internationalization, when you think about innovation, you can also think about these large elephants or gorillas or whatever you want to call them as potentially beneficial, which takes me nicely into my third point, which is the importance of networks. Okay? And this is something that most people intuitively understand. When you're a young company, when you're a small company, and you don't have a lot of resources, you have to use networks, right? The only thing I want to say here is we can try to be a bit smart in how we use networks. The fact that networks are important are very evident to you, I'm sure, because firms lacking resources will often try to compensate through networks. But here's what I want to say. There are three important things to understand. Networks must be leveraged proactively. Now, most people that I meet in a CEIBS classroom understand that. MBAs tend to be proactive sort of people, but it's still important to remind ourselves that, when you come into a setting which are rich in networks, even in a situation like that, nobody is sort of giving you network connections on a platter and saying, oh, here, please, I want you to, it's there. You have to take the initiative and go and talk to people, right? But I think a lot of people get that. But the other two things that are important are leveraging networks reflectively and leveraging networks discerningly. Let me talk about each of these in turn. So I did a piece of work some time ago, and I found that if you look at the level of network relationships of the entrepreneur and how much information they said they were getting from those networks, okay, so about a quarter of them were the ideal situation. They said they had a lot of networks and they were getting a lot of information, a lot of benefits from the network. The most important benefit most people get from their networks is information, right? So that's pretty good. That's the ideal situation. I'm sure all of you in this room are like that. But there were about half, to my big surprise, because most people think all entrepreneurs are great networkers. Actually, half of them said they didn't have a lot of networks and they didn't get a lot of information, So that's not ideal, and people here, I think, will struggle. The really impressive group was the small group that said we don't have a lot of networks, but what little networks we have, we get a lot of information from them. And my prediction is that group will move to this cell soon, because people like that usually are then able to expand their networks. But the group that really bothers me, and I didn't expect nearly 20% would be like this, they said they had a lot of networks, but they weren't getting a lot of information out of their networks. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm not saying that we should exploit our networks. I'm not saying you should be inauthentic. You should be phony, to use that American term. You shouldn't try to trick people into helping you. In the long run, that's a recipe for disaster. Okay? So we all have to be authentic. We have to be ourselves. And you don't even have to change your personality dramatically. A lot of people have this idea of a networker being someone who is very extroverted and, can schmooze and, in parties. But I have by now, by the way, I'm on the wrong side of 40. When I walk into an MBA classroom, sometimes people think I'm one of the students. I'm very flattered, but I actually have more gray hair than you can see, and a little bit of, I've been around long enough to talk to a lot of entrepreneurs in many parts of the world and come to this view that there is no single type of personality that an entrepreneur has, and there's no single type of personality that is good for networking. I think the important thing is being aware, self-aware of who you are and trying to approach networks in a sort of a win-win situation. You give and you receive. And it's important to make sure that you are leveraging these resources. That's point number one. But point number two, leveraging networks reflectively. What do I mean by that? I mean looking for knowledge as the primary benefit of networks, not revenue generating opportunities. Revenue generating opportunities are actually very important. If you're an entrepreneur, at the end of the day, you can't live on love, and air, fresh air. You need ultimately to generate revenues in some ways. I get that. However, I have found some entrepreneurs who evaluate the value of their networks purely in those terms. If I don't get business or if I don't get finance from this network relationship in 3 months, that's a bloody waste. I think that's just too narrow, because what's going to be the most sustainable benefit of network relationships is what you learn through them. And if the focus is so obsessively on these revenue generating opportunities or funding generating opportunities, then you don't stop to reflect on what it is you can be learning from these people. Because sometimes in mentoring relationships, for example, the great benefit is you share an experience and that person somehow helps you to think about your experience in a way that you come away thinking, maybe I could have done this differently. Okay, I'm going to try something else. And what is happening in this process is learning. I think the most value I add to a few of my students who are interested in entrepreneurship happens not in the classroom, but afterwards when they come and chat with me in the office. And they don't get new business because they have talked to me or new funding because they've talked to me, but hopefully they are able to leverage me as one of their network relationships reflectively and as an opportunity to think about things and learn. And in an internationalization context, that is especially important. Tapping network relationships as part of this learning process. And in that same study that I did, where I showed you that the proactive versus passive networkers, I found this clear relationship between people, the effective networkers, in terms of how much relationships they had and the knowledge that they were able to derive from that, which in turn helped these companies to have higher levels of performance. And the final point here is, so leverage networks proactively, leverage networks reflectively, but the third point is, because not all networks are the same. For example, we can think about interpersonal relationships, we can think about interorganizational relationships, but we can also consider how some people are more similar to us than others. We can also think about how to use different network relationships differently. I've already given you a sense of how inter-organizational relationships, there are some companies that are very different from you compared to others. So if you're a young company, working with other young companies, that's a peer relationship. That's another company that's sort of like you. But if you are Crowds, that little startup in Silicon Valley working with Barclays, these are highly dissimilar companies, correct? Now we can also think of that in terms of interpersonal relationships. Now, one of the first interesting things that happened for me when I had just moved to Ningbo 7 years ago. I was in my office with 4 undergrad students, a girl and 3 boys, and the girl's phone rang. So I just come to China and realized that in China you didn't have voice message. You couldn't leave a voice message. So I just told her, go ahead and answer. And, I just come to China, and then she was chatting away on the phone, and these 3 boys were giggling. That's the only term I can use, to describe her. And I felt very left out because, I had no idea what she was saying. I had 0 Chinese then. Now my Chinese is not great, but I can follow the gist of a conversation. And at the end of the conversation, when she hung up, so these guys are giggling. I have no idea what's going on, feeling very left out. They said to me, "Do you know why we were laughing?" I said, "Why?" They said, "We had no idea what she was talking." And all the people in that room were from Zhejiang province. Where do you think this girl was from? Where was she? No, they're all from Zhejiang province. So where do you think she was from? She was from Wenzhou. Yeah. Exactly. And I have become so fascinated with Wenzhou entrepreneurs because in Zhejiang province, as you all know, there's a very strong entrepreneurial sort of spirit in people across the province, but the Wenzhou people are distinct. And I think that example of their dialect being so distinct from even other places close by is indicative of the very tight networks that get developed over there. And so the people within the community are able to tap into that network. That is an example of interpersonal relationships with similar people. And that similarity translates very much in terms of international entrepreneurship. So there's a place in Italy near Milan called Prato, where unofficially they say about 1/4 of the population is from Wenzhou. And what has happened over time is that some Wenzhou entrepreneurs, they call themselves Wenzhou merchants, went there as apparel traders, clothing traders, and they would make the clothing in Wenzhou and bring it over. But as the community grew, they started establishing factories over there, and some of the friends and family were willing to come and work, maybe not at the at a bit of a discount maybe, or they were willing to work very hard. And all of a sudden you started having these guys producing clothes, and what is the label that they could now put on their clothes? Made in Italy. Yeah? This is one type of network. And by the way, I don't think the local Italian clothing companies were very amused. But you can also have interpersonal relationships with people who are completely different. Right? One of my students on the Global EA program is also from Wenzhou, and he started off working in a company which was basically producing things for foreign clients at a low cost, and he felt that this was no longer sustainable. He has now come up with high-end chemical products from Wenzhou, not competing on price, but competing on quality and innovation. And when I ask him who his important network relationships for going international are, he introduces me to a British person, a French person, not a fellow Wenzhounese person living over there. And to me, this is very interesting because we have to recognize that different types of relationships are useful in different ways. Similar relationships, personal, like co-ethnic personal ties, like a Wenzhou merchant working with other Wenzhou people, a Jewish merchant going and working with other Jews in New York. The diamond industry is controlled by a group of Orthodox Jews. They will shake hands, and that is the deal. They don't need a written contract. The Wenzhounese are like that. Why? Because there's deep trust. And you don't need the legal contract to make that happen. You have social sanctions. If the three of us are part of a community and I cheat you, my reputation with him is finished, right? And so I will not cheat her, not because I'm afraid of the law as much as I'm afraid of losing my social reputation within the group. So that is the big advantage of these relationships. But the problem with this, and the advantage that you get by expanding beyond that, is if I tell her something and afterwards she has a conversation with him, he will probably tell her the same thing that I told her. We call that information redundancy. In tight networks where everybody knows everyone else, there is limited benefit of knowing more people in terms of new information. That's what you need to step out of these similar connections for. The good news is nobody is saying you have to stop having these relationships. It's about having these and those. It's about having relationship with other entrepreneurs who can actually be very supportive and helpful, and perhaps thinking about dancing with gorillas as well. Now, what this means though is it becomes a much more complex process, but you have to be thinking about how you get different benefits. Trust from people who are like us, but novelty from people who are not like us. And so it's about achieving a balance between these and about having realistic expectations of what we can get from what types of network relationships. And as I mentioned, working with big companies can help. So with Testin, as they've been going international, they've been working with large Chinese companies and also tapping into the Microsoft relationship that they had established in Beijing, using now connections with Microsoft in the US. And I'm also seeing in some cases, foreign startups are trying to partner with large Chinese giants. Smart Tracker is a small Norwegian startup which was working with Huawei and trying to use that as a way to come into the Chinese market. Mango Technologies is a Bangalore-based startup that worked with Qualcomm and used that as a basis to get business in other markets as well. So my first 3 points have been learning to internationalize, the market learning piece, the innovation piece, which is not just about product innovation, but also process and business model. And then thirdly, networks. And networks, if they can also be an important part of the learning necessary for these first 2 points. Let me just move on now a little bit more quickly to, for the final couple of points. And that is to say, first of all, that with growth, when you're doing all of these 3 things that we've just been talking about, and the networks facilitate the innovation and the learning, that then gives you the basis for making decisions about where, how, and when to internationalize. And when you do this a number of times, and if these things work out, you begin to see international growth, right? So, in terms of where to internationalize, one has to be thinking about the initial entry. First of all, is it just opportunistic or is it strategic? By that I mean, you happen to get an opportunity to go to a particular market. Maybe one of your founders is married to somebody from that country, right? Maybe you have 2 co-founders who have started a company in China. One of them is married to a Malaysian. Immediately, that makes the Malaysian market somehow more accessible. Or, you're not starting with 0 networks there. And some companies will start with a market like Malaysia in that situation, opportunistically, and in some cases, that's perfectly fine. In other cases, they do it very strategically. They say, which is the most appropriate market for us to be looking at? And it might not be the US, it might be India, as you said, for a Chinese company. Whatever it is, that initial entry needs to be managed well, but you have to also recognize that's only the starting point. Because internationalization, if it is to result in growth, will typically include subsequent entries. And then the question is, what sort of market portfolio do we want to develop? Sometimes it's about sequence. Maybe the end goal is to enter the US and Western Europe, but we start with other emerging markets. Sometimes the goal is to enter other emerging markets, but you know that you will increase your respectability if you first succeeded in the US. There is no one formula for any company. Each company has to think it through in terms of their specific situations. You have the how to internationalize, where to think about what is my priority. Is it keeping costs low or keeping control very high? Because there's a trade-off here. If you want to have your own operations in another market, you can have a high degree of control, but it's very expensive. If you want to just do exports, then that can actually be fairly efficient to do. It's not very costly, but you don't have as much control once the product goes into the market. Also, do we want to do this in-house or do we want to partner? That becomes another very important consideration. And then you have the issue of speed. Is it better to wait till we have succeeded within the domestic market and internationalize gradually, or do we do this in a much more rapid way? Do we do this as soon as we are founded, or do we keep some sort of lag? And these are the strategic questions that must be managed in a way that ensures that the company's overall strategic performance is optimal. You can't make these decisions purely in isolation. Internationalization is only a means to an end, and that end is overall performance of the company. Now, in the case of Testin, they seem to be having two paces of development, two speeds. One speed is in terms of the global tester resources, because one of the things they've done is they've created a platform to connect companies needing testing services and providers of testing. So they have been able to tap testers across many parts of the world. My guess is in Europe and North America, many of them are ethnic Chinese people who have come onto the platform. But they have rapidly grown into over 30 countries. But if you look at their market seeking internationalization, they have only gone to one place. And that too within that one market, US, one location, which is San Francisco. So two different speeds at which they are operating. And another thing to be thinking about is, how are we going to think about it? There are two ways to make decisions. One, we start with the resources and capabilities we have and say, given these, what international decisions should we, what internationalization outcomes should we pursue? I have a Malaysian wife. Should I be thinking about Malaysia? So your starting point is what you have, rather than what you're trying to achieve. But the other way to think about it is, what goal do we want to achieve? Therefore, what resources, capabilities should we build? This opportunistic thinking can give you rapid growth in the short term. This more strategic thinking can give you rapid growth in the longer term. And I'm actually not here to tell you one is good and one is bad. I'm here to say that we need to balance the two, right? And very often it's at one point you will emphasize one, at another point you will emphasize the other. And the most important thing I want to say about managing growth is, internationalization is first of all not the right strategy for everybody, okay? And even when you're doing it, growing very fast has its own risks. Internationalization gives you higher prospects of growth, but it also increases the chance of the venture dying. It decreases the probability of survival, even though it increases the possibilities of growth. Because you're exposing yourself to more risks, you're spreading your resources more thinly, and so it's important to realize that there's a high financial risk. Some research has shown that the benefits of going beyond 5 markets is actually not that great for a very small company. So you have to guard against two risks: pursuing too many opportunities too soon, and then when you have problems, dealing with them in a very panicked sort of way, very knee-jerk reactions that cause you. So scaling up too fast or pivoting too fast. Both of these can be problematic, and that's why managing growth is important. So how do we address this risk? We need to first of all have this growth mindset. But I think when you're managing the risk, thinking about low-cost probes, if I'm finding that the US market is not working and I need to figure out if the European market can work, I don't have to now open a new European office, first of all. I can actually try to do some low-cost experiments to see whether the European market will work. And then, of course, delivering on milestones in the sense that don't try to do everything at once, break things down into milestones. Ultimately, resilience is needed. Okay, my final point, and I'm not going to spend buckets of time on this, but the key thing here is when we think about international markets, we often talk in terms of countries. And I said already, when we think about large countries especially, we need to be thinking about relatively smaller locations within those countries. When this Austrian company called Zotter Chocolate, it's a small or medium-sized company which is run by a family in Austria, and they make chocolate. Their brand is called Zotter, Z-O-T-T-E-R. If you look them up online, you will find them there. Chinese name is Janda, Zotter Chocolate. And they are famous in Europe because they do all kinds of crazy flavors. They have beer flavor chocolate, fish flavor chocolate, you know. When a company like that, small company in Austria, goes international, where do you think the first market they look to would be? What did you say? Oh, that's not a bad guess. But even before thinking of the UK, well, what market would an Austrian company think of? Germany, exactly. Austria would look at, if you're a Canadian company, what's the obvious market to look at? The US. If you are from New Zealand, the obvious country is Australia, right? So if you're from Austria, you would look at Germany, and that's what they did, and they internationalized. But then they wanted to think about going further afield, and they had to choose between the US and China. And for various reasons, they decided to choose China. What do you think was one of the first things they had to do? If you are a small Austrian company and you're thinking of entering the Chinese market, what's the most obvious thing you need? But you don't know the Chinese market.
Send an Austrian person to China. Austrian GM.
Well, that probably would make sense, but a partner. The obvious thing to do all of the things that you're talking about when you don't have a lot of experience, and even if you send somebody, you need a partner, correct? And this is a story for another day, how they went about doing it and so on. But they ended up with a partner who coincidentally is an EMBA alumna of CEIBS. And she told them, if you want to do business in Huangpu district in Shanghai, I can help you. If you're going to take one step outside this district, I cannot. These guys don't have a China strategy. They have a Huangpu district strategy. And I mean, you laugh, but that is absolutely critical, right? Because, I mean, and you understand that very, very much in the context of China, right? Because the number one asset of the partner is his or her guangxi. And this is not something that travels across many locations. And in a place like Shanghai, actually the different districts have their own different policies and ways of incentivizing foreign direct investment. And why was this important in this case? And I'll give you this example and then we'll stop. And if one or two questions, I'll be happy to take. What this company had discovered is because they had all these many wacky flavors, you really should look them up online. You'll be amazed at the kind of flavors they have. Plus, part of their story is that they are organic. Plus, they are very much socially conscious. They only have what they call fair trade practices. They make sure that the cocoa farmers in Ghana, Colombia, wherever, get fair prices and so on. It's a very complex story. What they figured was the best way for them to communicate this story, even in Austria, was to set up what they call the Zotter Chocolate Theater. And apparently it has become the biggest tourist attraction in that particular town in Austria called Bergel. And people can come and have a tour and understand how chocolate is made, but also understand about all this complex story of Zotter and all the things in it. So what they figured was, if they were going to come to China, the best thing to do was to bring the Zotter Chocolate Theater. And the first chocolate theater that they've opened outside of Austria is in China, in Shanghai, and in Huangpu district. But that is such a complex operation, because to set up something like that, you have to get multiple different permissions from different because they have to be able to sell food inside it, but it also has an aspect of being a tourist attraction, and then it has other aspects to it. So you need to have somebody who has relationships with all of these different departments, and even more importantly, right at the start, gives them a concept that they do not understand, because there is nothing like it. And the only reason that they get the government permissions is those government officials trust this individual, right? And only she, I think, could have delivered as a partner what that company needed to be able to set up. And this happened 3 years ago. The daughter of the founder came as that Austrian GM, but she couldn't have managed on her own without this partner. And then after 3 years, that theater broke even, and now she's gone back, and the Chinese partners continue to manage it. My point is, you need to understand the local context. And even for this company, they had to understand their local context from which they were coming, because when you think of chocolate, what country do you think of? Well, Belgium and Switzerland, right? You don't think of Austria. But if you happen to go to Austria, if you happen to go to Vienna, you will learn that one of the things that they're famous for is pastry. And in fact, this is a chocolate company that was founded by a pastry chef by accident, because one day he got an order for chocolate. He didn't have time to do it. He couldn't put things in a chocolate mold, and he used a technique of pastry making to make the chocolate, which is called a hand-scooped method, and it became a big hit. And so one of the part of the story of Zotter is they do hand-scooped chocolates, which you never get in Switzerland, which you can never get in Belgium, but it would only take, it could have only come from an Austrian pastry chef. And so you see how the local context influences what a company can do, which is unique. But also when you go international, you have to understand the local context into which you are going. And so doing this sort of thing, going international as a young company, is not for everybody. It's not easy. And you will find many, many more that fail at it than succeed. But I also believe that when you think about, take some of these principles into account, then hopefully you will increase your chances of success. The final thought I want to leave you with is, maybe you will never be part of a startup. And even if you are part of a startup, maybe you will not think of going international. But whenever you're trying to do something new in life with limited resources, think of these 5 principles. Learn efficiently, innovate holistically, leverage networks, manage growth, and embrace the local context. And I think you will find that it still holds you in good stead. So thank you very much. I hope you got something useful this afternoon. So there was one hand at the back and one hand here. Please.
Hi. I come from the finance industry, and for the couple actually for the several past months, in every occasion we've been talking about trade wars between US and China within the industry. So my question is, what do you think is the level of impact for the Chinese entrepreneurs and innovators to do business in the US or expand their business internationally, and vice versa, what is the impact of U.S. companies that are currently still growing in China?
Okay, great question. What was your question?
Let's get back to the Silicon Valley case. You just mentioned that Cafe, 10 startups, 10 startups approach Cafe, and they can set up the collaboration, partnership, relationship. So can we say that very good automate definition for a startup that's to be purchased by a big brand?
Okay. So two very good questions. So one is on the macro side, right? And facing turbulence is something that periodically companies will have to deal with. The turbulence can come from different sources. So if you think back to 9/11, that was not a fun time to be in the airline industry. And not a lot you could have done to what happened then. You just have to deal with those situations. I remember then a few years later in Europe, there was a problem with volcanic ash coming out of Iceland. Things happen, which are problematic, and what you are pointing to is now a much more sort of a bigger issue which affects a lot of different companies. So here I think one has to look at the specifics, the details, because right now we know that there are tariffs, but it actually does not affect all companies equally. I have a student on the Global EMBA who works for a steel company. This will affect them very directly. Nothing much you can do about it. They have no choice in the short term but to take it on the chin and then see how they can make adjustments. But there are other companies that actually are not going to be affected by this. So part of what one needs to do is to separate the generalized panic that one is feeling from the specifics. That's point number one. Point number two, though, is recognize that in this kind of environment, there will be hostility towards Chinese companies. The one thing that the Republicans and the Democrats seem to be to have a common view on is that we're afraid of China, right? So Chinese companies will find in the short term that there is some level of suspicion in the US. So again, here I would say a couple of things. One, I think especially the companies that already have exposure can work hard to engage with the local stakeholders, because again, local context matters, right? And America is huge. There are these different states, and within the different states, there is no real sort of one American culture in that sense, especially in their attitude towards foreign companies, and find ways in which to deepen that relationship. I mean, look at what Jack Ma did right after the Trump inauguration. He showed up, he got an appointment with Trump, and he said, we are committed to creating 1 million jobs. I mean, that is the way to engage with stakeholders there. And I think that aspect has to be worked very hard and has to be done very differently from how it's done in China. So the companies that acquire that international capability to do things in the way that works in the American context will do better. And remember, there are many American companies that are going to suffer because of this. They can find allies with appropriate American companies. Maybe not the legislators so importantly. The other side of the coin is to realize the world is big. And I think this is Europe's golden moment to tap into partnerships with Chinese companies at this time. And so it's a combination of 2-3 things. I think one is separate the panic from the facts. Second, deepen the stakeholder engagement with the stakeholders that can be supportive. And thirdly, look around. The US is a fantastic country. It will always be important. But when there are difficulties beyond one's control, I think important to look at other possibilities. I'm happy to talk offline some more. That's a very critical issue and not one I can do justice to in a couple, but hopefully you get a sense of some ways to think about it. Now, coming to this other question about startups working with multinationals and is the best outcome for the startup to be acquired by the large company? So I'll give you the answer that all academics give to a very intelligent but difficult question like this. The two-word answer is, what? It depends. Now, one of the things I was struck by in Israel when I visited in December, for many startups there, the end goal is this. It's to be acquired. They're not there to grow themselves organically, become big or anything, because they have no market. They are just a bunch of clever people who have figured out how to come up with innovative technology now. A lot of this has its roots, funnily enough, in the Israeli Air Force, more than in technology universities like in Silicon Valley. It's a different way, but they have figured out something, and they have no illusions that they're going to become big and grow. They just want to be acquired. Sort of marry me, take me. That's their attitude. Other companies have very different ambitions. As you probably know, Facebook received an offer from Google at one point to be acquired for $1 billion. Facebook said, thank you, but no thank you. That was the right call because they've grown and become big. And a few years later, Microsoft invested $1 billion in them, not for 100% of the company, but for just over 1% of the company. So it depends on what the ambitions of the startup are partly, and realistically what its growth prospects are. Because one of the things that entrepreneurs tell me again and again is, one of the regrets they made is they gave up control, too much control too soon. And for a company that wants to grow and become big and become a gorilla itself, that is obviously not the way forward. But sometimes it can become an objective, even though it wasn't the objective at the start. At the beginning, YouTube, the founders had the dream to grow the company and go IPO and become big. But very soon they realized that their big burden was fighting legal battles because of companies or people saying you're using our content. And then they realized this is too much for a startup. We need a company with deep pockets. And then they changed their strategy to, let's make sure that we get acquired by the best possible acquirer. And they positioned themselves to be acquired by Google. So in China, this is even more so because Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent are highly dominant. And compared to Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft and the equivalent companies in America, BAT is involved in much more investment in China. So in China, you will find that corporate venture capital accounts for about 40% of all VC. In the US, it'll be a much smaller proportion. So here we have these extra powerful gorillas. And so in China, it may be even more of an attractive option to be acquired by them, and I don't criticize any entrepreneur. It's just that you have to figure out there are trade-offs. If I go down this route, I will not grow. Is this something I want? And in many cases it works. And it works also because of data, right? What many of these startups these days are really generating is data is the new oil, right? And so that's what is creating the wealth, and the big companies like Tencent are able to tap into that data. But let me just end with one point. I showed you a slide of all the partners that Testin has developed over time. There are 3 companies that are conspicuous by their absence: Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Mr. Wang was in my classroom maybe years ago. I taught this case to the global MBA students, and then at the end, he came up and gave a speech. And the thing that everybody was surprised about was he kept resisting working with Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. He was been made acquisition offers by all of them, and he kept turning them down. Why? He said the reason we are able to value, the reason people come to us is trust. And we have the trust of customers because they see us as neutral. And so sometimes you actually have to say no, because if you went for an attractive offer, it undermines the fundamental premise of what you're offering customers. Okay, so thank you very much. It was a real pleasure, and maybe we'll meet again someday. Thank you.